A quiet 12-year-old boy wandered a few steps away from his classmates to admire a parked plane. Minutes later, police were circling him until his mother arrived, and everything flipped on its head. Malik Porter didn't talk much in class. He wasn't the kind of kid who raised his hand first or cracked jokes to get attention. But when his 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Dorsey, announced a field trip to Spokane Regional Airport, something lit up behind his eyes. For weeks, he counted down the days, scribbling the trip date on his notebook, talking about the planes he hoped to see, memorizing the specs of small aircraft most adults wouldn't even notice. That morning, he dressed carefully. White polo, dark jeans, sneakers just clean enough to pass his mom's inspection. Dr. Lenora Chase had kissed his forehead and said what she always said. "Stay curious, Malik. Ask smart questions." He nodded. Didn't say much, just smiled. That was his way. The school bus pulled up near the terminal just before 9:30 a.m. A volunteer from the airport's public relations team gave them all those bright orange visitor badges and a quick rundown of what to expect. Security briefings, a tour of the maintenance hangar, lunch in the break room above the concourse. Malik walked a little apart from the group, the way kids do when they're trying not to show how badly they want something. His eyes scanned the runway through the chain-link fence, then caught a single-engine Cessna 172, white with red trim, parked farther down near a row of other light aircraft. The plane looked peaceful, but powerful. He wanted to know what each switch inside that cockpit did. He wanted to sit in the pilot's seat and imagine liftoff. While the others clustered near the security gate, Malik edged forward a few extra steps. Not past the line, just far enough to get a better look. He didn't touch anything, didn't speak, just stared. About 30 yards away, behind the tinted glass of a private lounge, Greg Trumbull sipped his black coffee and frowned. The boy wasn't doing anything threatening, but something about the way he lingered near the planes didn't sit right with him. Greg had been a pilot for over 30 years, flew commercial until his knees gave out. Now he did occasional charter work and trained rookie flyers on weekends. He was old school, proud of it, and trusted his instincts. Maybe too much. He set the coffee down, reached for his phone, and dialed security. "There's a kid," he said. "Outside near the tarmac. Real close to my plane. Looks suspicious. You might want to send someone down." Within minutes, 2 uniformed airport security staff appeared at the gate. They approached Malik, asking him what he was doing, if he was with the school group, why he wasn't standing back with the others. Malik blinked, confused but polite. "I was just looking. I really like planes." The officers exchanged glances. One stepped aside and radioed local police. "Just for backup," he said. "Standard protocol." Across the way, Mrs. Dorsey noticed the growing tension and hurried over, her voice firm. "He's with us. He didn't do anything." But they weren't listening. Greg watched from inside. The boy was now flanked by 2 more men in blue. He felt a flicker of discomfort, but told himself it was better to be safe. After all, you couldn't be too careful these days. One of the officers started asking Malik if he had any ID. The boy's voice stayed steady, though it shook a little when he repeated his name and school. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said. "I just wanted to see the plane up close." But what started as a harmless school trip was about to spiral into something much bigger. The police car pulled up fast, tires pressing the curb hard as Officer Brandon Keene stepped out, adjusting his belt before walking toward the cluster by the fence. He wasn't in a bad mood, necessarily, but something about the radio call. Possible security concern involving an unsupervised juvenile near aircraft had already framed the situation in his head. Malik was still standing still, hands slightly out to his sides like he'd seen people do on TV when they didn't want trouble. His backpack was slung over one shoulder, one sneaker untied. His classmates were just beginning to notice something was wrong. "Kid, you got a parent with you?" Officer Keene asked. Malik shook his head. "I'm here with my school. They're right there." He pointed to the group now awkwardly huddled near the terminal entrance. Some of his classmates were staring. A few whispered, "You with them?" Keene turned to Mrs. Dorsey, who had stepped closer. "Ma'am?" "Yes," she said. stepping forward, voice tight. "This is Malik Porter. He's in my homeroom. He hasn't done anything wrong." Greg Trumbull had come outside now. He stood a few feet behind the officers, arms crossed, watching. He didn't say anything at first, but the posture was enough, like he was there to confirm something, to back someone up. His presence added weight. Another officer arrived, this one quieter, a little older. He stayed back, watching Keen's interaction with the boy. Security personnel radioed in that the area was clear, no breach of access, no signs of tampering. But the police didn't leave. They kept asking Malik the same questions in slightly different ways. Where were you standing? How close did you get? Did you touch anything? Why did you walk ahead of the group? Malik's voice started thinning out. He looked over at Mrs. Dorsey again, then at the other kids. One girl had pulled out her phone, recording quietly. Another boy whispered, "Dang, what did he even do?" Mrs. Dorsey tried again. "Officers, with all due respect, this is a child. He didn't cross any barriers. He didn't do anything dangerous." Officer Keen didn't even look at her. His eyes stayed on Malik. Greg finally spoke. "I don't know what he was doing, but when I saw him from the lounge, it didn't look right. He was real close to the Cessna." Keen nodded slightly. "Appreciate the heads up, sir." To Malik, the moment felt unreal. His heart thudded like it did when he forgot a homework assignment. Only this time, it wasn't about a grade. It was about how they were looking at him. Like he wasn't supposed to be there. Like just standing near a plane made him dangerous. He kept quiet. Kept still. Mrs. Dorsey pulled out her phone. "I'm calling his mother," she said firmly. "Now." Down the road, a sleek black SUV turned into the airport parking lot. The tires didn't screech. The engine didn't roar. But something about the quiet arrival felt different. Inside the SUV, Dr. Lenora Chase was already removing her sunglasses. She hadn't answered on the first ring. She'd been in a virtual FAA meeting with regional directors. But when Mrs. Dorsey's name came through the second time in less than a minute, something in her gut told her to step out. Her son was in trouble. She didn't know how much, but enough that her voice had gone cold when she said to her assistant, "Reschedule everything. I'm going to Spokane Regional. Now." Dr. Chase was not tall, not loud. She didn't need to be. She walked with that kind of presence people don't fully notice until they're trying to figure out why the room just changed. She stepped through the terminal doors and scanned the open area, eyes quickly locking onto the group near the chain-link fence. She saw Malik, saw the officers, saw Greg. And something in her face, not anger, but something sharper, made one of the security guards instinctively step back. But none of them had any idea who was about to walk through that terminal door. Lenora didn't rush. She didn't need to. Every step was deliberate, eyes focused only on her son. Malik saw her before the officers did. Relief washed over his face, but he didn't move. He didn't want to do anything that would look suspicious. He'd already learned that even small movements could be read the wrong way. Dr. Chase walked up slowly and placed a hand on Malik's shoulder. Then she looked at Officer Keen. "I'm his mother," she said. Keen blinked. "And you are?" She reached into her blazer and calmly pulled out her credentials. Not a driver's license, not a staff ID. Her FAA identification badge. Gold letters, full clearance. "Dr. Lenora Chase, Administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration." That hung in the air for a few seconds, long enough for the younger officer to glance at Keen, who was now trying to mask the fact that he was caught off guard. Greg, standing just a few feet away, stiffened. "FAA?" Keen asked, voice lower now. "As in Washington?" "Yes, as in D.C., as in the federal authority over everything that flies in and out of this country, including this airport, including that Cessna." Her eyes flicked toward Greg. "And including the way your security procedures are carried out." Greg's mouth opened like he had something to say, but no words came. She crouched slightly to Malik's level. "Are you okay, baby?" He nodded. "I didn't do anything. I was just looking at the plane." "I know," she said, brushing his shoulder gently. Then she stood, her gaze shifting back to Keen. "Tell me something, officer. If my son had blonde hair and freckles, would we be standing here right now?" Keen's lips parted like he might respond. But nothing came out. The question wasn't even accusatory, just flat. Tired. Greg stepped forward then, trying to reassert some kind of authority. "Look, I didn't mean anything by it. I just saw a kid near my plane. I didn't know if—" "You didn't know," Lenora interrupted, turning to face him. "But you assumed." Her tone hadn't changed. No shouting, no sarcasm, just clarity. "You saw a young boy standing respectfully near a fence, and the first thing you did was pick up your phone. Not to ask questions, not to notify his teacher. You called security." Greg's face reddened. "I've had issues before. Kids sneaking onto the ramp. It's a safety concern." "Safety?" she repeated. "Let me ask you, how many 12-year-olds do you think have the skill set to hotwire a Cessna and take off down a runway?" One of the officers chuckled softly, then looked down when Keen gave him a sharp look. Greg tried again. "I didn't know who he was. He was close to the plane. I thought—" "You thought he didn't belong," she said, this time letting the silence stretch just a second longer. "And you acted on that thought. That's the problem." Mrs. Dorsey finally stepped in, trying to ease the tension. "Dr. Chase, we're all so sorry this happened. Malik's been nothing but respectful. The kids are upset. They don't understand what's going on. They shouldn't have to," Lenora said. "He came here to learn, to be inspired. Instead, he's being taught to fear the spaces he dreams of working in." She looked at Greg again. "Do you know how many times I've had to fight for the right to be in rooms like the one I came from this morning? Rooms full of men who think like you. And now, here we are. My son, 12 years old, already learning the cost of your assumptions." Greg didn't respond. He couldn't. The words hit somewhere he didn't expect. Malik stayed silent, but his eyes were locked on his mom. The way she spoke, the way nobody dared interrupt her. Lenora sighed and gently placed her hand on her son's back. "We're leaving now," she said. "But this isn't over." But that revelation was just the beginning of a very uncomfortable conversation. The group slowly moved toward the terminal building. Dr. Chase walked ahead with Malik, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. Behind them, Officer Keen and his partner exchanged quiet words with the security guards, now clearly unsure of their own footing. Greg Trumbull didn't follow. He stood a few paces away, watching, arms folded, not out of confidence now, but uncertainty. Inside the small conference room just off the main hallway, Lenora asked for privacy. Mrs. Dorsey stayed with the other students, while the assistant airport director, 2 officers, Tsar, and Greg entered the room with her. Malik sat in a chair against the wall, quiet but alert. Dr. Chase remained standing. "Before I say anything," she began, "I want each of you to take a minute and ask yourself what you honestly thought you saw this morning." No one spoke. "I don't need rehearsed apologies or PR-safe answers. I'm not here to make this go away quietly. I want to talk about what really happened out there and what it represents." Greg shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. "I just called it in because I saw someone I didn't recognize near the aircraft." "Someone," she repeated. "Not a threat, not a trespasser, just someone." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, I wasn't trying to start something, but you did. And it started the moment you didn't ask a single question before dialing security. What would have happened if I hadn't shown up when I did?" The room fell silent again. Keen spoke up this time, trying to redirect. "We're trained to respond to calls like that with caution. We didn't touch the boy, we didn't detain him. But you treated him like a problem," she said firmly. "You questioned a child standing near a fence at an educational event as if he were casing the runway." Officer Keen's voice dropped. "We're sorry. I didn't realize who he was." "You don't need to realize who he is," she said sharply. "That's the point. You don't get to treat someone with respect only after you find out who they're connected to." Malik shifted in his seat, watching the adults speak around him. Greg spoke again, quieter this time. "I think I messed up." Dr. Chase finally looked at him. I don't think you're a bad man, Mr. Trumbull, but I do think you've lived long enough with your instincts unchallenged. And that's dangerous. Greg's jaw clenched. His hands were locked together in front of him. He wasn't used to being spoken to this way, especially not in a room where he once held the most experience. But there was no defense left, no protocol to fall back on. I see young people like my son every day, Dr. Chase continued. Smart, curious, hungry to learn, and I know exactly what it takes for them to stay that way in a world that tells them, subtly and loudly, that they're out of place. She paused, then turned slightly toward the officers. It's not enough to avoid overt harm. You have to stop normalizing the suspicion. You can't teach safety if your definition of danger is based on familiarity and bias. No one interrupted. There was nothing to say. Finally, she looked down at Malik. You okay, baby? He nodded. I just wanted to see the plane. Greg's eyes dropped to the floor. Lenora turned to the room one last time. You all owe my son something far more valuable than an apology. You owe him the right to feel like he belongs in spaces like this. She gathered her things, thanked Mrs. Dorsey outside, and walked with Malik toward the exit. The school bus was waiting, but Lenora would be driving him home. Not because he was shaken, but because she needed him close that day. Inside the building, Greg remained seated in the empty room long after they left. But the aftermath wouldn't just end at the airport that day. By that evening, the story had already found its way online. The video a student recorded, barely 2 minutes long, opened with Malik standing between two officers, head down, while a woman's voice off-screen whispered, "He didn't do anything." The clip didn't show any shouting, no violence, just a child surrounded by uniforms and the quiet tension of something that should have never happened. But the moment Dr. Lenora Chase walked into frame and identified herself, that changed everything. Someone uploaded the footage with the caption, "Boy harassed at airport for looking at plane." Then his mom shows up. She runs the FAA, sir. Within hours, it had over 700,000 views. Comments poured in. She handled that with more grace than most of us would have. That boy didn't even flinch. Kids like him grow up knowing how to move carefully. Imagine being that pilot right now. Respect to Dr. Chase. She didn't yell. She educated the room. News outlets reached out quickly. ABC, NPR, even international channels. FAA's media office scrambled to coordinate statements. And although Dr. Chase declined interviews, the agency released a short, pointed message. Our administrator responded to an incident involving her child today. We are reviewing the circumstances internally. The FAA remains committed to equity in access to aviation spaces. It was the most restrained version of what really happened, and yet it lit up the headlines. At the airport, Greg Trumbull couldn't avoid the fallout. His name hadn't been in the video, but local pilots knew. One posted a short blog post titled, "When Fear Trumps Curiosity," which mentioned Greg by first name. It was just enough to start the conversations. People didn't cancel him, not fully. But they did begin to question how often situations like that happened, and just never made it to video. One morning, Greg walked into a training session he normally led and found someone else running it. No explanation, just a quiet shift, he understood. In his gut, he knew he'd triggered something larger than he was ready for. Malik, meanwhile, tried to go back to normal. But how do you do that when your face is all over the internet? Teachers treated him more cautiously, too cautiously. Friends asked awkward questions, some out of concern, others out of curiosity. At lunch, a classmate asked if he was going to be famous now. Malik shrugged and said, "I'd rather just be a pilot." Dr. Chase kept things steady at home. She cooked a little more that week, sat at the table longer, asked about his classes, and didn't check emails during dinner. One night, she knocked gently on Malik's bedroom door. "Can I come in?" He was at his desk, drawing a jet with a sharp pencil. "Yeah," he said, spinning slowly in his chair. "I got a letter today," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed. "From Mr. Trumbull." Malik's eyes lifted. "What did he say?" "He apologized," she said. "A real apology. Not a PR one. Said he'd been thinking a lot since that day. Said he's been wrong before, but but this time it really stuck with him. Malik didn't say anything at first. Is he in trouble? Not the kind that involves handcuffs, she replied. The kind that makes you sit with your own reflection a little too long. He gave a quiet laugh, the first real one in days. Dr. Chase continued. He asked if there was a way to make things right. I haven't answered yet. Maybe he could do something for other kids. Malik said after a pause. Not for me. For kids who don't think they belong. Lenora looked at her son like she was seeing something brand new in him. That's a good idea. But what mattered most wasn't the headlines. It was what happened behind the scenes. 3 weeks later, Greg Trumbull walked into a small community event held at the Airway Heights Municipal Hangar just outside Spokane. The banner above the entrance read, Youth in Aviation. Imagine the Skies. FAA Mentorship Program. He wasn't scheduled to speak. He hadn't even planned to attend. Not until he received a personal invitation signed by Dr. Lenora Chase. He thought about ignoring it. Thought maybe it'd be better to stay quiet and let things fade. But something kept pulling at him. An ache to make things right, not just with words, but with presence. Inside, the space had been transformed. Tables with flight simulators lined one side, poster boards explaining different careers in aviation on the other. Kids ranging from 10 to 16 rotated through stations, eyes wide, hands busy. Most of them had never been inside an aircraft hangar before. Greg stood off to the side, unsure where to go. Then he saw her, Dr. Chase, standing beside a group of teenage girls as they tested out a flight control panel. She looked relaxed, proud. She saw Greg the same moment and gave a short nod. Nothing more, but it was enough to let him know she hadn't forgotten. 10 minutes later, she walked over. I wasn't sure you'd come, she said. I wasn't sure either, he replied, his voice low. They stood in silence for a beat. I read your letter, she said. I appreciated the honesty. I meant every word, he said. I've done a lot of thinking. I can't take back what happened, but I'd like to help open this space to more kids, especially the ones I never pictured here before. Lenora tilted her head slightly. You mean the ones you once saw as outsiders? Greg looked away, nodding. Yeah, she didn't make it easy. But she didn't shut the door either. There's a group speaking at 3, she said. High schoolers building their first glider. We could use someone to explain stall recovery if you're up for it. He blinked. You want me to? You asked to help, she said simply. Here's your chance. Greg nodded. Not out of pride. Out of willingness. An hour later, he stood in front of 12 teens holding notebooks and wide eyes. He explained concepts like lift and drag, then paused when a girl raised her hand and asked if flying scared him the first time. He smiled. Yeah, scared me a lot. But the cockpit doesn't care who's nervous. It only cares if you're prepared. That answer landed. Back near the entryway, Malik watched the exchange from behind a table stacked with brochures. He didn't walk over, didn't interrupt. But he saw Greg talking to the kids. Really talking, listening too. Later that afternoon, Greg approached him. Malik, he said. The boy looked up, cautious but calm. I owe you something. I didn't see you clearly that day, and that's my fault, not yours. Malik nodded, still silent. Greg offered a hesitant smile. You're the kind of kid who's going to change a lot of minds someday. Malik gave a small shrug. I just like planes, Greg chuckled. That's a pretty good place to start. Back inside the hangar, the FAA's mentorship program was gathering momentum. Dr. Chase had arranged for local aviation schools to send representatives. They were offering scholarships now, real ones, the kind Malik would be eligible for in a few years. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever really fixed a moment like that. But this was something more than cleanup. It was movement. Forward. Mutual. Greg stayed after the event, helping pack up tables, talking to staff, asking about future sessions. He didn't need to be convinced anymore. He just needed to keep showing up. But the real lesson wasn't about redemption. It was about responsibility. 3 months later, Malik sat cross-legged on the carpet of his school library, surrounded by a small group of classmates. A sign on the door read, Aviation Club. Wednesdays after school. What started as a quiet idea after the field trip had grown into something real. Real enough that the principal helped them find a space, and real enough that the school counselor arranged a surprise video chat last week with an Air Force pilot who looked just like Malik. The room wasn't fancy, just a few beanbags, donated model planes, and hand-me-down posters. But for the dozen kids who showed up every week, it felt like something important. Malik adjusted the controls on the flight simulator laptop they'd borrowed from a local STEM nonprofit. A sixth grader beside him asked how many hours a pilot needed to fly a commercial plane. 1,500, Malik said confidently, not even looking up. But you can start training way before that. He spoke differently now. Not louder, just clearer. The hesitation was gone. Across town, Dr. Chase sat in a conference room in Seattle, reviewing proposals for a new FAA initiative, Aerospace Access. Her plan was bold. Bring aviation education to middle schools in underserved communities across the country, not just as electives, but as core curriculum. Real tools, real mentorship, real access. She was pushing the agency harder than some liked, but she'd stopped apologizing for that years ago. Later that evening, back at home, she found Malik on the couch sketching a Boeing 737 from memory. "You're getting good at those," she said, peering over his shoulder. "I want to build one someday," he said. "Not just fly it." She sat beside him, brushing a crumb off his sleeve. "You will," she said. "And more." He looked at her for a moment. "Do you think Mr. Trumbull's different now?" She paused. "I think he's trying. And sometimes trying is the first real thing people do that matters." Malik thought about that for a second. "Some people only see what they expect to see." She smiled faintly. "And that's why you show them more." The house was quiet. No headlines, no reporters, just a mother and son sharing a moment that didn't need explanation. Elsewhere, Greg Trumbull was getting ready for a weekend youth workshop. He'd volunteered to bring 3 aircraft manuals and 2 demo radios. He was still learning how to speak differently, how to listen better. But he kept showing up. He'd stopped seeing kids like Malik as question marks and started seeing them as mirrors. Reminders of what the industry could be if people stopped guarding the gate and started opening the door. And while the world had moved on from the viral moment, the ripples were still there, quiet, steady. Kids now knew the name Lenora Chase. They saw someone who looked like them in charge of the skies. And for many, that was the first time they realized this path wasn't someone else's lane. It could be theirs. Malik didn't need to be famous. He didn't need the spotlight. He just needed space to grow without having to defend why he was standing there in the first place. The moral wasn't just about race or airports or protocol. It was about the power of pause, the moment before you act, where you choose to assume the best in someone, not the worst. That moment can save a childhood, or change a future. So the next time you're in a position to judge, to call, to act, ask yourself, am I making this choice out of caution, or out of fear disguised as instinct? Because one will protect, the other can destroy. If this story moved you, share it. Reflect on it. And if you haven't already, subscribe. We tell real stories here, stories that make us better, one truth at a time.